the Clockwork Veil. The click of Jeremy Colter's heels echoed along the deserted 7th Street of Bridgeport. At 3 in the morning, the sound felt blasphemously loud, like a drum roll crashing through a funeral. Streetlights cast a yellowish glow onto the wet asphalt, encircling him with a halo as if he were the star of some cheap theatrical production. A bottle of Old Overholt sloshed warmly in his stomach, like an old friend. Jeremy wasn't an alcoholic. At least, that's what he told himself. The rye whiskey simply helped him cope with what people called life. Today, it helped him cope with Lindsay Mayer. His hand slipped into the pocket of his worn trench coat, brushing against the dagger. Its silver handle felt warm, sticky. He recalled the day Mrs. Mayer had given it to him, a Christmas evening at their home, filled with the scent of gingerbread and pine, Lindsay's face glowing with happiness. Cut through the truth, not envelopes. The irony twisted his lips into a dry, cracked laugh, the sound of a man who'd long forgotten how it was done. Lindsay had screamed about Account 613. She'd screamed about documents, audits, federal agents. She screamed and screamed and screamed, until she didn't. Lindsay knew everything. Account 613, the number of that cursed safe in his office where he stashed dirty money laundered through shell companies. For Jeremy, those 3 digits were a symbol, etched into his father's watch, the last thing the man left before vanishing into the night years ago. But for Lindsay, it was a personal stash she dipped into to flaunt her Burberry scarves and drive her shiny new Volvo. Her mother lived in a Victorian mansion on Oak Street, dripping with gold and crystal, yet Lindsay revelled in it when Jeremy footed the bill. It gave her power, as intoxicating as her perfume. She'd seen that safe in his office, watched him open it as they sipped whiskey after another successful day. It was she who whispered that they deserved more, nudging him towards shadier deals. Then came the fight. It started over nothing, spilled wine on the carpet, but his nerves were frayed, and he snapped at her extravagance. Lindsay knew how to hit where it hurt. "I'll tell everything, Jeremy," she hissed, standing in the middle of the apartment in her silk robe, glass in hand. "The feds are already sniffing around your precious 613. One call, and you'll rot in a cell while I watch them tear you apart. You think I don't know what's in that safe? I've seen it. I've seen your papers." Her voice trembled with venom, but her eyes blazed with cold fire. She wasn't bluffing. She knew Account 613 was his weak spot and held it like an ace up her sleeve. Maybe once he could have calmed her, reasoned with her. But the past few months had been an endless black streak, failed deals, a stalled promotion, and those strange dreams haunting him every night. Dreams of being watched, waiting. He felt something inside him breaking day by day, thinning like an old clock spring. When Lindsay started screaming today, something clicked in his head. The dagger, resting on the nightstand by the sofa, seemed to glide into his hand. Jeremy pulled out a pack of Camel Crush, another bad habit he couldn't shake, and flicked his lighter. The flame wavered in the wind, but held, much like his resolve to finish what he'd started. Next in line, the old woman. He smirked bitterly, thinking of Mrs. Mayer. That hag had trained her darling daughter to bend everyone to her will, turning people into her puppets. For years, he'd watched Lindsay become a copy of her mother. Same dominance, same manipulativeness, same cold calculation masked by a warm smile. Jeremy had no doubt that, at Lindsay's age, Mrs. Mayer had screamed plenty of suitors into submission. Like mother, like daughter, 2 sides of the same counterfeit coin. The wet sound of sliced flesh and Lindsay's wheezing collapse as she fell to the floor of her apartment still rang in his ears. Her disbelieving eyes stared at him until the light faded. At the corner of 7th and Maple Street, his boot nudged something soft. A wallet. Plain brown leather, worn at the edges, the kind you'd find in any mall. "Don't pick it up. Keep walking. It's not your business." But Jeremy bent down and lifted it. $439 in small bills, as if someone had been saving for something big. A driver's license for Thomas Jenkins, a name that meant nothing to him, and a photograph. A small, faded picture of 7-year-old Lindsay Mayer in a frilly dress, her gap-toothed smile beaming. He flipped it over, in childish, uneven scrawl. "Thank you for the watch, Uncle Colter." A chill slithered down his spine. His father, Robert Colter, had worked on that watch a month before his mysterious disappearance. No one knew if he'd fled or met a worse fate. He'd simply left his watchmaker's bench one day, tools neatly arranged as if he'd return any moment. "Bullshit," he hissed, nervously pulling out another cigarette. The filter crunched under his fingers, the menthol bursting coolly into the smoke. Just a coincidence. The watch on his wrist, his family's Colter watch, 613, engraved on the inside, suddenly stopped. He held it to his ear. Silence. The hands froze at 7:15. The exact moment Susie slipped under the water, when you stood on the shore and did nothing. "Shut up," he muttered, unaware he'd spoken aloud. Rain began to drizzle as he turned onto Oak Street, where Evelyn Mayer, Lindsay's mother, lived in her cozy Victorian home. Mrs. Mayer's house loomed at the end of the street, a 3-story Victorian monster with turrets and bay windows, like something out of an Edgar Allan Poe story. Now, in the dim streetlight and growing rain, it seemed alive, poised to strike. Jeremy climbed the porch steps, each creaking under his weight, as if warning the house's occupant of an intruder. Lindsay's keys, fished from her purse after her blood stopped flowing, lay cold and slick in his sweaty palm, as if they too sweated in fear of what he intended. They nearly slipped from his trembling fingers as he fumbled them into the lock, his sticky sweat mingling with the rainwater dripping from his hair. The door gave way surprisingly easily, as if the house had been expecting him. A yellowish light seeped through the gap, and for a moment he froze, gripped by an inexplicable urge to turn back. But it was too late. It was always too late. He crept through the silent hall. Something told him where to go. Climbing the stairs, he headed toward the mistress's bedroom. The door stood ajar, soft lamplight spilling out. "Mrs. Mayer," he called, trying to sound normal, not like a man who'd slit her daughter's throat an hour ago. He pushed the door and stopped dead. Evelyn Mayer sat in a vintage armchair by the window, as if awaiting his arrival. At 75, she looked fragile as a dried flower, but her eyes, brown like Lindsay's, held a sharp, piercing clarity. "Jeremy." Her voice quavered with surprise, and he could swear, fear. "Why are you here? Where's Lindsay? Tell her. Tell her what you did to her girl." He pulled out a cigarette. His hands shook treacherously, and it took 2 clicks of the lighter to spark a flame. The smoke of Camel Crush coiled around his head like a sinner's halo. "Mrs. Mayer, The words stuck in his throat like a bone. Then something strange happened. The watch on his wrist, silent until that moment, jolted alive. But the hands spun backward, fast, with a quiet, sinister ticking. Jeremy froze, unable to believe his eyes. The cigarette hung mid-air on its way to his mouth. "What the hell?" he whispered. And then the old woman smiled. Not the nervous smile people use to mask fear, but a wide, joyful grin, like someone greeting an old friend. Her wrinkled face transformed, becoming almost beautiful, almost young. She said nothing, just stared at him with that eerie smile that sent shivers down his spine, as if she knew what was coming, as if she'd been waiting for it. The rain outside intensified sharply. Drops hammered the glass with the fury of suicides. Jeremy couldn't remember when the downpour had grown so fierce. It reminded him of his childhood in Oklahoma, where tornadoes were part of everyday life. That tornado that grazed your house, that very day when father didn't come home and mother said he'd gone on business. The wallpaper suddenly stirred, as if insects scurried beneath it. Jeremy blinked, certain it was just a trick of shadows or a side effect of the whiskey. Then his attention snapped to movement outside. Through the rain-streaked living room window, he saw a figure standing on the lawn. A tall man in a dark cloak stood motionless under the downpour, staring at the house. His face was hidden in shadow, yet Jeremy somehow felt he knew him. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing at the window. But when he turned back, Mrs. Mayer was gone. He rushed to the kitchen, but the old woman wasn't there. The front door stood open, and he wondered if she'd fled. He returned to close it, but when he checked, it wouldn't budge. The door, which he certainly hadn't locked minutes ago, now stood unyielding. No matter how hard he yanked the handle, it remained shut. "Mrs. Mayer!" he shouted, panic rising. "Where are you?" Silence. Only the rain pounded the roof, and a knock? Yes, a knock at the door. 3 slow, heavy thuds reverberated through the house's walls. Jeremy jumped at the sound. Who could it be at this hour? The man from the lawn, perhaps. He approached the door and peered through the peephole, seeing only darkness. "Who's there?" he yelled, but there was no reply. Just 3 more knocks, louder and more insistent. He tried to open the door, but it still wouldn't give. The lock was jammed, the handle frozen. The knocking stopped as abruptly as it began. Jeremy pressed his ear to the door, and at that moment he heard glass shattering from the 2nd floor. Someone broke a window. His heart pounded like a bird in a cage. He dashed to the stairs, leaping 2 steps at a time. On the 2nd floor, he paused, listening. A cold draft seeped from under a door at the end of the hall. The bedroom, he guessed. "Mrs. Mayer," he called again, inching forward. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, each step loud as a gunshot. The bedroom door was ajar. Jeremy cautiously pushed it open and peered inside. The room was cloaked in gloom, lit only by an old lamp on the nightstand. The window was shattered, glass scattered across the floor, cold night air and rain gusting in. But no sign of Mrs. Mayer or an intruder. He stepped inside, glass crunching under his boots. He scanned the room. It looked untouched, save for the broken window, an antique dressing table with framed photos, a large canopied bed, a dark wooden dresser, all in place. He approached the window, stepping carefully between the shards. Peering out, he saw no cloaked figure, no one at all, just an empty, rain-soaked lawn and a dark street. When he turned back to the room, something caught his eye. The photographs on the dressing table. Everyone featured the same person. Him, Jeremy Colter. Jeremy as a child, Jeremy as a teenager, Jeremy in college, Jeremy last week leaving the office. Pictures he didn't recognize, pictures that couldn't exist. Then he heard them. Footsteps on the roof. Quick, light steps, like children playing tag overhead. But this wasn't a flat-roofed house, and no children could be up there, especially in this storm. Overwhelmed by the mounting pressure, Jeremy bolted from the room and raced back down the hall. Evelyn Mayer stood at the staircase, still smiling. And then he heard it, the sound of the front door opening downstairs. A slow, agonizing creak of hinges, as if someone deliberately prolonged the moment. Jeremy froze, staring at the old woman, whose smile widened, baring yellowish teeth. "It's here," she whispered, almost tenderly. Then came the footsteps. The first thud on the parquet below shook the house. Floorboards groaned, the chandelier in the hall swayed, a porcelain figurine fell and shattered. The second step was even heavier. Jeremy felt the vibration rise through his legs, reverberating in his knees. This can't be human, a panicked thought flashed. No one can weigh that much. In a surge of primal fear, Jeremy fled back into the room where, moments ago, glass had sprinkled the expensive oak floor. He couldn't understand why a man who, 30 minutes earlier, had killed another person and was ready to take another life without fear or regret, now felt like a frightened child facing the unknown. But he couldn't help it. It was as if, with that open door, a primal, sticky fear had entered the house. No, not just fear. It was a terror he'd never experienced before. The killer realized he was living through the most frightening moment of his life. In his 42 years, he'd faced plenty of fears and traumas. The moment on the shore of Lake Rugo, that evening that took his little sister's love for him, along with her under the ice, was worth something. He often recalled that moment. It haunted his nightmares more than once. But his very being understood that what was happening now was beyond comparison. One could swear most people would never experience the degree of nightmare advancing toward him with those approaching steps. A third step. Something began ascending the stairs, each step bending with a crack, as if about to snap. Jeremy backed away, cold sweat trickling down his spine. His nostrils filled with a smell he'd never sensed before, a mix of ozone, rotting flesh, and something metallic, ancient. "What is it?" he rasped, but his throat was so dry the words were barely audible. The footsteps grew closer, slow, methodical. Whatever was climbing the stairs wasn't in a hurry. It knew its prey had nowhere to run. Jeremy tried to swallow, but couldn't. His tongue felt swollen, glued to the roof of his mouth. His heart pounded so hard he was sure it would burst through his chest. A shadow on the stairwell wall grew, twisting and writhing in an utterly unnatural way. It didn't match a human form. Too many angles, too many limbs moving out of sync. The watch on Jeremy's wrist suddenly burned red hot, searing his skin, but he couldn't even scream. The terror of what was about to appear around the corner paralyzed him. The creature's head emerged first. Jeremy blinked, refusing to believe what his eyes saw. Then came the shoulders, if those writhing tendrils could be called that. Its mass flowed over the steps, as if gravity were a minor inconvenience. When the creature fully appeared on the second-floor landing, Jeremy felt warm liquid trickle down his leg. He'd wet himself without realizing it. And then something in his mind cracked as his eyes finally registered what stood before him. Jeremy turned slowly. The moment his gaze met what stood in the corridor, part of his mind shut off, like a burnt-out bulb. What stood before him wasn't just a violation of physics. It was an insult to the very concept of reality. The creature loomed nearly to the ceiling, yet somehow Jeremy knew he was seeing only a fraction of its true size, the rest existing elsewhere, seeping into this world like water through a poorly sealed crack. Where its eyes should have been were two pulsing voids, not mere black holes, but an absence of everything, light, matter, meaning. Staring into them, Jeremy felt something in his consciousness crack and crumble. A substance oozed from those voids, not a liquid, but darkness in its purest form, concentrated nothingness. Its skin, if it could be called that, resembled the surface of boiling asphalt, constantly shifting and reforming. Cracks opened and closed in a perverse rhythm, and with each movement, vapors rose, leaving a metallic taste in Jeremy's mouth. When the creature's maw opened, it was like a tear in the fabric of existence. Inside, Jeremy saw not teeth or a tongue, but geometric constructs that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. Angles that were both sharp and obtuse, shapes expanding inward rather than outward. Looking at them, he felt nausea roll over him. The sound emanating from its depths wasn't a roar or growl, but something far more grotesque, a symphony of unnatural noises. The buzzing of insects, a baby's wail, metal scraping glass, all merged into a sonic landscape of nightmare. Each note of this cacophony triggered a different reaction in Jeremy's body. Gagging, a perverse arousal, a urge to claw out his own eyes. Its limbs moved with the fluidity of mercury, defying all notions of proper motion. One moment there were 4, the next 8 or 12. They ended not in fingers or claws, but in shards of broken glass, each reflecting a different version of the future. And in every reflection, Jeremy saw his death, each one unique, each one agonizing. But the worst, the most unbearable, was the recognition. Looking at this creature, Jeremy felt the same sensation as meeting an old friend after years apart. Deep within, beneath layers of civility and rationality, he knew this thing. More than that, he was it, or part of it, or it was part of him. The creature smiled, not with a physical motion, but with its very being, its essence. And Jeremy felt something deep inside him respond, an ancient, ravenous thing that had been awakening in him throughout his life. It was always you. From that night, you found Father's old watch and saw the numbers inside the lid. 613, the account number, the beast's number. "You've been waiting for me," Jeremy said, his voice sounding alien to him. "All this time." The creature didn't reply, not with words. But suddenly, visions flooded Jeremy's mind. His father hunched over a workbench, carving strange symbols into the watch's inner lid. His sister Susie stepping onto thin ice and vanishing beneath it. Himself standing over Lindsay's body with a bloodied dagger. And behind all these images stood it, the creature from the corridor, watching, guiding, waiting. "What do you want?" he whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. The creature took a step forward, and the space around it warped, as if reality couldn't bear its presence. It extended one of its impossible limbs and touched the dagger in Jeremy's pocket. The contact was like an electric shock, jolting through his entire body. And suddenly he understood. He understood everything. Account 613, his father's death, Susie's drowning, Lindsay's murder, all pieces of a single ritual stretching across decades. A ritual in which he was both priest and sacrifice. Jeremy looked at Mrs. Mayer, still wearing her eerie, knowing smile. She knew. She'd always known. He drew the dagger from his pocket, silver, with a clock hand hilt, Lindsay's dried blood crusting the blade. "Another sacrifice," he said, his voice calm, almost detached. "Is that what you want?" The creature didn't answer, but Jeremy didn't need it to. He'd known since the night he found his father's notes about the entity that dwells between the ticks of a clock, in the gaps between seconds. He pressed the dagger to his throat, feeling the cold metal against his skin. "This isn't the end," Mrs. Mayer said, her voice young and full of strength. "It's only the beginning. The clock will keep ticking, Jeremy. It always keeps ticking." In his final moment, he glanced at the shattered bedroom window and saw him, the man in the dark cloak, standing just outside, though it was the second floor. The figure slowly raised a hand and lifted his hood. The face beneath was Jeremy Colter's, but not his current self, a younger version, from 20 years ago, when he'd found those cursed watch. As the dagger sliced his throat, the last thing Jeremy saw was the creature dissolving into the air, like smoke from his final cigarette. And in that moment, he realized it wasn't leaving. It was merging into him, becoming part of him even in death. As life drained from his body, no montage of past days flashed before Jeremy's eyes like a single canvas. No, he found himself once more on the shores of the frigid Rugo on that grim evening. And in that instant, a thought struck him. Before his sister's death, he'd been worthy of happiness and success, capable of rising to become a significant figure in this world. But that evening by the lake had turned him into a petty bribe-taker, defiling his father's last gift. He'd linked the number on that gift to the number of a dirty safe, holding the secrets of his illicit earnings and laundered savings, a number that led to the death of his colleague and lover. Even in his final hours, Jeremy couldn't bear the weight of his guilt. It was easier to place it on the fragile shoulders of his younger sister, whose mind had once buckled under a new breakdown. And the watch on his wrist suddenly ticked normally again, its hands moving forward, counting down to the next appearance of that which waits between seconds.